So let's look at three kinds of companies that we could potentially invest in our in my IRA. Harmful to the environment. The clear example is fossil fuel companies, coal, oil, natural gas. They all produce products, and if the product gets used, that puts greenhouse gases in the air and helps the climate cook even faster. Beneficial to the environment, there are fairly new companies, a lot of them, but these are companies that are deliberately working to improve the climate or mitigate climate change. For example, the companies that make these solar panels or that install these wind turbines. And then in between these two extremes is everything else. And that extreme, that is vast expanse, really does cover everything. It could be construction or agriculture or clothing or communication, transportation, technologies of various kinds. It can be all sorts of things. The list really just goes on. So let's think about how we can invest in these three kinds of climate. I don't call them the good, the bad, and the ugly. I call them the good, the bad, and the so-so. The first step, in my opinion, is to divest the harmful stocks. Now, some groups don't have that opinion, such as the Presbyterian MRTI, whatever that stands for. But for our purposes and for my purposes as an investor, for myself, for my retirement, I think I don't want to own these stocks. And this is not part of my retirement plan. This is beforehand, clearing out the way before I do my retirement plan. So if I have oil stocks, I sell them. If I have a mutual fund, I look and see what does it invest in. And if you see a bunch of oil or gas or coal companies in there, I would say, get rid of that mutual fund, swap it out for something else. All this is easy if you're tax-free, if you're working from an IRA. You can make exchanges without taxes. So why do I do this? For me, there's a profound ethical basis. Love your neighbor. Suppose I had a retirement plan. I think of it as a big sort of blob here. And sitting in there are shares of, say, Exxon stock. So Exxon, the company, is out there drilling down for oil and fracking the soil to get natural gas, doing its thing, making a hefty profit. And every 3 months, it takes some of its profit and distributes it to the shareholders. So I got a quarterly dividend coming into my retirement account every 3 months, and that grows up, adds to my savings, helps save for the future. But at what cost? Where does that money come from? Well, it comes from all the activity that was making life profoundly uncomfortable for lots of people, potentially billions of people, not for a decade or so, but for centuries. That is not a fair trade, to trade my few years of retirement and comfort for all that misery out there. And so I don't want to have any part of that. And it's all based on, well, simple acts of fairness or love your neighbor. Now here here I could stop and go on to, well, okay, so what do you invest in? But some people might come up and say, wait a minute, you left out something. When I divested from the oil stocks, didn't that help the climate right there? And my answer is no, not at all. The oil stock had been sending me quarterly dividends. I don't like that, so I sell my stock. Now the oil company sends the quarterly dividends to somebody else. Now Exxon doesn't care whose name is on the stock shares. It just sends them out and goes on doing its own thing. And that's why I say my divestment has no effect on the climate, no effect on the company, and therefore no effect on the climate. I do have one weasel word here, word direct. There are some papers I found, I've got them in my folder, and they looked at times when there was a big campaign, highly publicized, to get companies and corporations and people to divest from oil stocks. They were after the big money, the university endowments, pension funds, insurance companies. Little guys like me, well, okay, yeah, go ahead and divest also. And they were doing this with lots of publicity, people marching in the streets, big signs up, letters to the editors, news clips on the evening news, articles in the newspapers and in magazines. And all this publicity in the past has not had much effect on the companies, but it has had an effect on the public consciousness, so that people nowadays recognize the terms when you say fossil fuel or greenhouse gas or CO2, and the connection. The newspapers are continually saying now the connection between fossil fuels and climate warming. So these publicity campaigns have an indirect effect, and I can't quantify or figure out how long it will take for that to change the climate, but I have to stop there so I can go on to, let's figure out what I should be putting into my retirement plan. I've got a choice of the good or the so-so. Let's start with the good. A good means the company is actively working to improve the environment, which, well, so suppose I find some stock, say, that's making solar panels, and they're doing it in a good way. They give decent wages to their employees and decent benefits, and their management is diverse, lots of different viewpoints and backgrounds, so they see questions from various points of view, and they're making a good profit. So, because there's a big need for solar panels. So here I see a company that's doing a good thing in a good way, and of course, I buy it, put it in my retirement plan. And if the company is as good as I think it is, I bought these shares of a small company, but the company is going to grow, and that will make shares of a big company, and that means they've gone up in value, and that's good for my retirement savings. But what has it done for the world in general, the economy, the climate? Nothing. It's exactly like what happened when I was divesting from a bad stock. Now I'm investing in a good stock, but that's just between me and the person I bought the stock from. The quarterly dividends come to me now instead of the other guy, but it doesn't do a thing. It doesn't encourage the company to turn out more solar panels just because I bought their stock from somebody else. So I haven't found a way to achieve transformation yet. So now let's think about the so-so companies. They're the ones, they're my last hope. What do I do with them? They are really big, important companies. They're the ones, we all know their names. But their activities sometimes have side effects, which are detrimental. And how do we encourage them to be better for the environment? Well, here I got to spill the beans. I said I would have a mutual fund in my IRA. It can't be any old mutual fund. It has to be a special kind, a shareholder advocacy mutual fund. And the way that works is, if anybody, a fund or an individual, if anybody owns a company's stock, that makes the owner partial, that makes the person a partial owner of the company, with all the rights and privileges inherent therein, or something like that. One of the rights of a stock owner is I can vote on individual questions that come up for the annual meetings. Another right is I can attend the annual meeting, if I want to. Another right is if I want to put a proposal to the whole mass of owners, all the shareholders, I can write a shareholder proposal and ask them to vote on it. Now that is hard work. It takes a lot of effort to get the background information, and it's certainly hard for me. But if I can find a mutual fund that will do that work, if I can get a mutual fund that buys the stock, takes the ownership seriously, and then I want the mutual fund to look for things that might need improvement and advocate with the company to make changes. This is transformative. This makes things happen that wouldn't happen otherwise. When I found one of these on the internet, I said, that's what I'm looking for. I wonder if there's a better one somewhere. So I went searching. It took me quite a few months to search everything out and check everything out. Eliminate a bunch that say, oh, we are an impact company, but they weren't really. I finally found 7 financial firms that had a mutual fund or a family of mutual funds and that advocated for the climate. Here's a true example. In 2018, there was a shareholder advocacy mutual fund that owned some shares of Verizon. As we all know, Verizon is all over the country, and it uses a lot of electricity, which it purchases all over the country. It doesn't generate its own electricity, it buys it from power companies, and they have to generate it from some means. Well, the board of, or the mutual fund that had bought the stock in Verizon looked at the company reports, the annual reports, that found somewhere in the fine print, 4% of the electricity used by Verizon came from clean sources, solar and wind. 96% of the electricity that Verizon used came from dirty sources, coal, oil, natural gas. And they said 96%, we don't want to own a company like that. So they contacted the board of directors and asked to meet with them. So they sent materials asking Verizon to change their policies and get more clean energy. So They had a meeting. I didn't attend the meeting. I haven't seen the minutes. I know the outcome, but I don't know what they said. But in my imagination, I imagine they might have said something like this. The mutual fund personnel would arrive and Verizon people said, "We're glad you called this meeting. We are always so glad to hear from our shareholders. We've studied the material you sent us. We hear what you're saying, and you raise some valid points. But you've got to understand, we're buying energy from lots of different companies. We've cultivated the relationships with these other companies, these power companies. They give us good rates. And frankly, we don't think it's in Verizon's best financial interests to make the switch you're asking for. So, no. So then, in my imagination, the people from the mutual fund picked up their laptops and said, well, thank you very much for hearing us out. That's how it goes sometimes. We don't always see eye to eye with the companies we're talking to. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to go back to our offices and draft a shareholder proposal, which will make this request formally. And we'll present this proposal at the annual meeting of Verizon and put it to a vote of all the shareholders and see what happens. And so they went back to their offices. And now there was a complication which just happened because this is a true example. It happened, there was a second mutual fund that also had shares of Verizon, and they also had these same ideals or goals for climate change. So they came to the first fund and said, hey, we hear you're writing a shareholder proposal. We would like to co-sponsor it with you. And so the two of them sat down and started trying to write the most persuasive proposal they could. And I don't know when this next thing happened or who it was, but somebody must have said, hey folks, maybe we ought to have another meeting. So they did. Representatives of the two mutual funds and representatives of Verizon came together. They had a meeting, and from that meeting developed another meeting, and from that meeting, another meeting. And in the course of these meetings, Verizon actually came up with a plan that they said was technologically workable and financially doable, that would take the percentage of clean energy going into their electricity from 4% up to 50% by the year 2025. And this was acceptable to everybody. So the two mutual funds withdrew their proposal. They never presented it at the 29 meeting. And Vanguard got to work on implementing this agreement they had. Now, I'm very happy to know that Verizon is in the process of converting to clean sourced electricity. But I'm jumping up and down excited to know that my money, if it goes into that mutual fund or one like it, and then the mutual fund does things like this, that I can have a part in making a change. This is the transformative effect that I wanted my money to have.
Yay.
Yeah. When I found out about this, I said, I've got to tell people, because I didn't know this could be done 3 years ago. Mark?
5 minutes.
5 minutes. So I said, well, I'll make it a website. And so I did, greenira.org. It describes what I just said. It lists these 7 firms which have families and mutual funds that practice shareholder advocacy for the climate. And it takes information I got from the internet about these companies that they put out, and I put little descriptions into my website. It also goes into related topics like, what if you want to invest in bonds instead of stocks? Well, that can be done too. Or some people say, I don't know about something you said. Well, I've got some annotated references here, short bibliography, and frequently asked questions. And that gives you anybody enough information so they can get started looking for a way to have transformative investing in their IRA. So remember the goals. I have two goals. One was to save for future needs, and the other was to work now to transform the climate.
Yeah.
And I've just told you how I am accomplishing that. Oh.
I'll do that.
Okay.
Why don't you find us?
Yeah, there's no time for questions.
We'll do questions for all of you at the end.
Okay.
Yep.
But I do have an email address.
All right, Dan, are you ready to start sharing?
I'm working on it.
Okay.
How are you feeling, Dad?
Much better, thank you. Okay. Now,
We
I
are seeing
can't,
the climate crisis empowering hope.
okay, hang on, there we go. I'm not seeing any of you though, and I don't like that.
Oh.
Let's see. Somewhere there's got to be a view. Lets me see you.
Yeah, that will be on your end under look up at view options at the top.
Yeah, except I'm not seeing a view options.
Oh, okay. Why? Oh. Well, to save time, it may be best if you just
Oh man,
realize we're here.
I can't do any of my interactive stuff if I can't see you guys. That's
Okay, all right.
But anyway, I'll just dive in. Can you see me? Am I somewhere on the screen?
No, you are not.
Okay, so all you can see.
We can hear you.
We hear you and we see your presentation, Faithful Banking Workshop 6.
Okay, so I can make funny faces and things and nobody will know.
You got it.
Cool. Okay. I'm gonna take a different direction. And Mark, did you just say something?
I was just saying, someone in the chat just said that someone does see you.
Someone does see me, huh? Uh-oh, so I can't make funny faces. All right. I also can't get feedback from the chat because I can't see my chat anywhere. What? Oh, I can pull up the chat. Hang on. All right. You can interact with me on the chat if you wish, because I can see the chat, but I can't see your lovely faces. Okay, so let's go. I'm going to take a little bit of a walk down memory lane. Does anybody recognize this picture? You can blurt it out. I can hear your microphones if you turn your mics on. I'm not hearing anything. That looks like a pretty satanic picture, doesn't it? It's the cover art from an article written by Bill McKibben in the Rolling Stone back in July of 2012. It's called Global Warming's Terrifying New Math. Does that ring a bell with anybody?
Yes.
Yes. Those who were involved in the divestment effort over the last decade might recognize this article. It actually developed into a tour by Bill McKibben and Naomi Klein. I think they went to 18 cities in 21 days, or 21 cities in 18 days, something like that, where they did what they called the Do the Math tour and presented the information in this article as kind of a PowerPoint presentation. And they tried to turn it into a movie and win an Academy Award, but they made the movie. They didn't get the Academy Award. But they did trigger First Presbyterian Palo Alto drafted the first few drafts of the fossil fuel divestment overture that went to General Assembly in Detroit in 2014. Just as an interesting side note, First Presbyterian Palo Alto is where Bill McKibben was baptized 60 some odd years ago. So just an interesting side note. So in 2014, the Fossil Free PCUSA submitted the first divestment overture to General Assembly. It was vehemently opposed by MRTI and as a result, voted down by General Assembly. 2016, Fossil Free PCUSA did it again. This time, rather than about a dozen presbyteries, there was about 30 presbyteries that concurred with the overture. And again, MRTI opposed it vehemently. And again, General Assembly voted it down. 2018, same thing happened. This time there were a couple of overtures that were advocating for MRTI. MRTI is the Mission Responsibility Through Investing Committee of the Presbyterian Church, who's basically doing the same kinds of things that Cory suggested that the 7 mutual fund companies that he discovered were doing. They are advocating, but in this case, they believe that they can convert fossil-free companies from a fossil fuel companies from a fossil fuel production business model to something else. And so far that hasn't been very effective. So in 2018, we had about 50 concurring presbyteries that supported the overtures on divestment. And again, MRTI opposed it and said, give us a couple of years to study this issue and we'll come back with a report. So it didn't work in 2018. Here's a picture from the floor of the convention center in St. Louis where this was debated. It was a fossil fuel die-in. Still didn't sway General Assembly from voting in favor of categorical divestment from fossil fuels. Well, MRTI did come back with a report in 2020. And nothing happened for reasons that, well, it was 2020. But they did recommend at that point that at least 2 fossil fuel companies should be divested from. So that was forward progress, but there was no vote. And then finally, as you probably know, in 2022, General Assembly accepted a report from MRTI to divest from 5 fossil fuel companies and voted, as we heard yesterday at the MRTI panel discussion, voted by 9-1 in favor of divestment. So that's success, right? Well, we've divested from 5. Did it work? Did it do what we wanted it to do? We got the headlines. Here's one headline from the National Catholic Reporter saying that we finally divested from 5 companies. But the question is divestment effective? And Cory suggested that at least on an individual basis, divestment isn't. But maybe on a larger basis, it is. As it turns out, the fossil fuel divestment campaign over the last 10 years has been the most successful divestment effort ever launched. And here's a breakdown in a pie chart of the organizations, the institutions that have committed to some form of fossil fuel divestment. The fascinating thing is that these institutions represent $40 trillion in worldwide economy. If you were at the MRTI panel yesterday, you may have heard I think it was either James or Rob Four mentioned that they're working with a consortium of investors that represent $4 trillion, and that with $4 trillion, they actually have a little bit of clout with these companies. Well, if 4 trillion represents a bit of clout, you can imagine what $40 trillion divesting from these companies might have as an impact. Another interesting thing, 35% of the institutions that are divesting are faith-based institutions. And I guess at this stage, we would be counted among those. So globally, the divestment campaign over the last 10 years has been profoundly effective. But what about for the Presbyterian Church? For that, we've got to dive into the S&P 500. Why? Well, the S&P 500 is the index fund that the foundation, at least, and maybe the Board of Pensions, I don't know for sure, uses to construct their portfolio. They start with the S&P 500, and then they go to the General Assembly divestment list that's published every year, and they remove those companies that are on the divestment list. And then they build their portfolio from there. So here's what happens over time with the S&P 500. You can see the 500 companies that are represented in this index across that horizontal line in the middle, and it's broken into 11 different colored categories.
Coral Reef.
Coral Reef. Yeah, it kind of looks that way. And this one's alive too. The lavender group is the energy sector of the 11 sectors in the S&P 500. And interestingly, energy is a misnomer here because it's only fossil energy. It's not solar energy, it's not wind energy, it's only fossil energy, and that's historical. But here's what happened to the S&P 500 companies in the first quarter of this year as they evolved, and some of them grew in value, some of them lost shareholder value. They all kind of evolved over time. So this is a dynamic system. It changes over time. And by the end of March, we can see that most of the energy sector in the first quarter of this year lost value. You can see that XOM kind of right at the zero line. That's Exxon, and they sort of held their ground, but that's about the best you could say for them. And the index as a whole went up 7.5% over that 3-month period, but most of the energy, fossil energy stocks went down. Okay, so then the question becomes, if General Assembly asked the foundation and the Board of Pensions to divest from those 5 companies, what actually happened? For that, let's dive a little bit deeper into the energy sector specifically. Here's how the 24 or so companies from the S&P 500 energy sector split out at the end of the second quarter of this year. That would have been end of June. Exxon, Chevron. You can see, if you go around the circle, you can see Marathon, Phillips, and Valero, the 5. Exxon and Chevron are the 2 big chunks in this pie. And once the foundation, for example, divested from those 5 companies, they ended up with a pot full of cash from the half of the sector that they divested from. So then the question becomes, what happens to that cash? It can't stay as cash. This is the whole goal of the foundation is to invest that money. So what do they do with it? I don't know if anybody's got a guess. What would they do with all that cash? Would they spread it out proportionally over the rest of the index?
Put it in the windows.
Put it back into the fossil fuel industry elsewhere.
Yeah.
Oh, come on, Mark, you knew the answer. That's exactly what they did. They took the 55 roughly percent of the money they divested, and they poured it back into the fossil fuel sector through an operation called rebalancing the portfolio. This is just what is done. It preserves that share of the fossil industry, but as Cory lamented, it made no difference. So we still own exactly the same amount of fossil fuel shares as we owned before. We just happen to own them in different companies.
Dan, what's your source for that?
The
How do you
source,
know what they've done?
yeah, the source for that comes from an email exchange that I had after There was a PEC, was it PEC involved in it? There was a webinar in late January with MRTI, and kind of similar to the panel yesterday, where they talked about their strategy. And I asked a similar question to the one I asked yesterday about how was that money redistributed, and basically was told in an email that it was rebalanced and redistributed in exactly the same percentages as it was held to divesting. I have no idea if the Board of Pensions follows the same kind of a protocol, but it's pretty standard in the industry, and there wouldn't be any reason to suspect that it's not the case.
So you need to remove the people serving on the boards for not following General Assembly guidance, is what you're saying.
No, not at all. They followed exactly what General Assembly guided them to do, which was to divest from those 5 companies. They did exactly as they were expected. They acted in good faith. And then the rebalancing protocols kicked in, and they reinvested that money in other fossil fuel companies. But what that does point to is the fact that selective divestment in this case does not work when it's the industry that you need to divest from, not an individual bad actor. So, once again, we've got to go back and we've got to take another look at how do we convince our denomination that categorical divestment is the way that we've got to go here. So, that's the first half of my talk. Now, the second half of my talk actually gets into banking, believe it or not. The question is now what? Well, before we leave the divestment stuff, we can divest at other places than just the denomination. The Synod of the Northeast divested. National Capital Presbytery, Mark's Presbytery, divested. Individual congregations have divested. Church of the Covenant in Boston is a joint congregation with the UCC and the PCUSA, and they are fully divested. So that's step one in Cory's paradigm, getting rid of the bad stuff. So there's still a lot of opportunity for individual congregations and presbyteries and even synods to go forward with this work, or other agencies of the church. But if we go beyond just divesting, then maybe we need to look at our bank accounts. And this is where things take on yet another dimension. Does anybody recognize this picture? That's another article by Bill McKibben, this time in the New Yorker, this time in September 2019. And this one's titled, "Money is the Oxygen on Which the Fire of Global Warming Burns." And basically the idea here is that if the banks and the asset management companies and the insurance industries don't invest or insure in fossil fuel infrastructure projects, they can't happen. So what is the banking industry doing in terms of financing and propping up all of these new projects by the fossil fuel industry? You could ask yourself, well, what do banks have to do with it? And, we've all got bank accounts one way or another. We've got credit cards and bank accounts. Our institutions have bank accounts and credit cards. The denomination has a bank account somewhere. Our congregations do, our presbyteries do. And that money doesn't just sit in the bank, it gets used by the bank to make more money. And one of the ways that it gets used, a significant way, is to invest in fossil fuel projects, fossil infrastructure projects. And in fact, the research indicates that $62,000 roughly of money in the mainstream banking system overall is the equivalent of 6 months, a half a year, of the carbon footprint of an average American. So if you've got about $100,000 sitting in the banks, that's about the same carbon footprint as everything else you do in a year. So that's something that should get your attention and get you to start thinking about, well, what can we do about that? Well, Rainforest Action Network, since 2017 probably, has been publishing an annual report called Banking on Climate Chaos. And they're tracking the 60 biggest banks in the world internationally and ranking them based on how much they're investing in fossil fuel infrastructure projects. Here's the results for the Dirty Dozen from 2023, the 2023 report, which reports on 2022 cumulative investment over time. And what you can see here is that the top 4 banks internationally investing in fossil fuel infrastructure projects are all American banks. Chase is number 1, Citibank's number 2, Wells Fargo's number 3, Bank of America is number 4. Between them, since the Paris Accord was signed in 2016, they've invested about $1.4 trillion, which is probably about the same amount of money that was pledged to be divested by those 1,500 financial institutions. So these 4 banks are making money on those investments, and they are continuing to support and invest in the fossil fuel industry. You can go all the way down to number 12 on that list. It's Morgan Stanley, so that's another American bank. Number 5 is RBC. That's the Royal Bank of Canada. So we've got some Canadian tar sands coming in there too. So there's a lot of money there. Let's take another look at that chart. This is the same data. We're getting into iChart domain here. These are, you're probably not going to be able to read all of this stuff, but I'll just kind of talk you through it. Again, we see those top 4 banks here on the side. And this, whoops, I jumped the gun. There we go. You can see the top 4, and you can see that it falls off fairly quickly by the time you get down to Morgan Stanley at number 12. They're at about roughly a third of the size of Chase. But I asked the question early on, who does your congregation or your presbytery or your denomination bank with? And if you're banking with one of those top 4, you might want to say, well, maybe it's time for me to change banks, or cut up my credit cards and find a greener credit card, or at least have a conversation with those banks about not investing quite so much in the fossil fuel industry. After a little digging, I discovered that as you go down on this list, now we're looking at roughly the middle part of the list in the 30s. You see US Bank Corp and PNC, which are ranked 34 and 35 on the list of the 60 biggest banks internationally. And as it turns out, PNC, which is Pittsburgh something or other, Pittsburgh National Bank, is the bank that the Presbyterian Church does its banking with. And US Bank Corp is the bank that the foundation does a lot of their banking with. Then you might say, well, okay, they're middle of the list. They're not perfect, but we can't expect perfection. We're living in the real world. So, okay, we can maybe give them a pass and concentrate on those top 4. Maybe ask your congregation whether you're banking with Chase or Citibank or Bank of America. And do something about it if you are, but don't worry about these guys in the middle, right? Well, here's another way of looking at that data. And now you're getting to the point where there's no way you're going to be able to read the information on here. And that's okay, because most of the information is captured in the colors. Red is bad, green is good. Okay, so JP Morgan Chase is at the top. And here's the actual investments that they made in kind of red colors across the top from 2016 to 2022. And as you go down the list, near the bottom of the chart, you might be able to pick out US Bank Corp again and PNC, and they're kind of in the middle in yellow, which again, doesn't look too bad. They're small banks, smaller, so their investments are smaller. But then the question becomes, what do we expect these banks to do? If we want them to behave appropriately, we want them to stop investing in fossil fuel projects. And in other words, we want them to bring their investments down to zero by some point in the future. If you were involved in the divestment campaigns within the church, you might recall that the request was for the church to be fully divested from the fossil fuel companies in 5 years. Well, we could give the banks a little bit more time. Let's give them to 2030, since this is all based on the IPCC agreement from 2015. Let's say that we want them at zero by 2030. So if you look way over to the right on this slide, you see a green column there. That represents zero investment. And this is kind of a linear ramp that each of these banks would have to follow in order to get to zero by the appropriate time. And again, if you look at PNC, their ramp is pretty much green already. That's down here. They're pretty much green already, so that's pretty good. But again, these numbers are all based on the size of the investment. And if you're a smaller bank, you're going to have a smaller investment. So what we want to see is whether or not each of these banks is doing better or worse than that ramp that we just indicated. This is pretty wonky stuff, isn't it? We're down.
Yay.
Yeah. So again, if you look at the top, you can see that Morgan Chase, they're kind of orangish. They're up here at the top. They're kind of orangish. And it sort of goes, oh, here's a green one. They're kind of green all the way across. Who's that? Oh, that's Bank of China. Goldman Sachs has a little bit of green at one end or the other. Credit Suisse. Credit Suisse looks like they're on the right track. They're going from kind of a golden brown to green over here. So they're doing what they're supposed to do. That's pretty good. Here's another one. That's Deutsche Bank. They're doing pretty good. Well, let's go all the way down to PNC again. PNC starts here at a pretty low number. But wait a minute, they're going in the wrong direction. They're starting yellowish, ending up pretty golden orange. So they're going exactly the opposite way that they ought to. That's not a good sign. And maybe there's a better way to take a look at this. Rather than looking at it by total size of the investment, which for a smaller bank would be smaller, let's look at it by the percent invested. Whoops. And if you look at the percent invested, look at PNC. Oh, wait a minute. They've got the reddest number on the chart down here in the bottom half, way in 2022. So PNC is not looking like a good actor here. They're punching way above their weight as far as their investments in banks. So maybe Presbyterian Church as a denomination has something to say to PNC.
Oh, yeah, it's still.
Have I lost everybody in the room?
No, but do you
Okay.
But if we're gonna have time for Q&A, then I need to wrap up because we need to finish by 11:30.
Okay. So let me buzz forward. So what can we do? What can we do? That was all stuff. One thing that we can do is we can pledge not to bank with those 4 bad actors, or not to bank with other actors like PNC that we may have better influence with because they are the bank that we as Presbyterians as a denomination are banking with. So I encourage you to look up the Banking on Our Future pledge on thirdact.org and sign the pledge. And think about where your church is banking and whether or not it's one of the dirty banks. Third Act is also getting ready to start next week a Costco credit card campaign. This is when I wanted to ask everybody whether or not you shop at Costco. I don't. There's not one near me. But Costco uses Citibank for their credit card services. And if you use a Costco credit card to buy stuff at Costco, you are basically funneling money to Citibank. And the hope here is that Third Act and Stop the Money Pipeline will start a nationwide campaign that we can get our churches involved in to pressure Costco to switch banks or pressure Citibank to change their investment strategies. So indirect pressure here. So here's a couple of organizations that you as individuals can, if you want to move your money to another bank, if you want to cut up your credit cards and find a better one, you can work with Stop the Money Pipeline. You can work with thisiswhatwedid.org. They will actually give you half-hour coaching sessions with a phone call or a Zoom call to help walk you through the process of getting your money out of dirty banks and finding cleaner banks to put them into. Down there at the bottom, some of you might recognize Abby Mohout, who has been working with Green Faith over the last few years on the fossil fuel investment part of this whole deal with asset managers and things like that. So Green Faith is involved in all of this. Also, I'd encourage you to consider joining Third Act Faith. We're working nationally with a bunch of different denominations to try to do programs like that Costco program and move forward. We can have an overture discussion about what kinds of overtures might make sense, but to Mark's point, let's wrap it up at this point, and I'll just share a list of links for some of the stuff that I talked about in the course of this presentation, and I'll down my slides and we can have a conversation with questions for either me or for Cory.
Great, thank you very much, Dan. You've given us a lot to work with there. And between you and Cory, a nice set of tools. Does anyone in the room have questions first? And if you have questions in the chat, please type them in and we'll get to them.
Well, my question was, with the chart on the percent of divestment that showed faith-based being 34%, is that a percent of institutions or a percent of the dollar amount?
I think that was the number of institutions. I'd have to dig into that and find out for sure exactly what they were reporting there. But I think that's just the number of institutions that were part of that nearly 1,600 institutions in the list.
Good question. Dollars would be more meaningful, but yeah, they're both important ways to count things. Jenny?
Did you put in the link for your charts? Some of us couldn't read.
Well, the presentations will be in the resources, so.
Okay, thank you.
So all that will be in there, and Dan, if you can have links to where a lot of those things came from, that'd be great. We'll put them in the resources.
Yep. I covered most of those in that last slide, but there's probably a few that I'm still missing.
Great, thank you, Cory.
And we will get the resource thing by email.
Actually, you can get to the resource thing right now. Go to the conference website, and there's a link to the resource page. There's also an email that was sent out should have gone to all of you yesterday with a link to the resource page. So those are already up there, and they're growing as we speak. So just because we're getting it to the information today doesn't mean it's going up today. It'll take a little bit of time. The only ones that are going up right away are the ones people need during the conference. But yeah, we'll get it all there.
I saw some chats that were having trouble finding stuff on mygreenira.org.
Yes.
Did that get resolved, or do I need to answer anything?
So one question was people were wondering what MRTI was. Sorry, Dan, you didn't go quite to that basic, but it was answered in there. There was a question on the Green IRA. It's one person said Green IRA has not listed the firms on the web yet. Can you name them orally? And then someone else answered that they're coming up, and there was a page with the firms that was linked. So
it's within Green IRA, yeah.
Yeah, if you take a look and make sure things are there, though,
You have to click and wander around in the website.
Okay, so it should all be in there at this point. Great. Other questions? Yes.
It's just a comment. I find it annoying that Costco requires you to have a city card for a membership card, but you do not have to use the membership card to charge anything. So we have the card, unfortunately, and we don't use it. It's just to get us in and out of the store.
Interesting, because our membership,
A Costco card without Citibank.
our Costco membership card just gets us into the store. We don't have their credit card at all.
No,
So
mine,
it,
I don't know, mine's tied to the credit card.
yeah, it may depend on how their Costco's set up, but, you know. Let's see, I don't see any questions in the chat yet. Was there anything early on before I got on, Bruce?
Nah,
Okay. Cory?
By coincidence, do I need to get near the L or is?
Can everyone hear Cory asking a question?
Nobody heard anything.
I can hear Cory, but he's a little bit garbled because of the echo in the room.
Yeah.
Okay. By coincidence, one of my my favorite website mutual funds, one of my favorite green transformative mutual funds listed Costco as one of their #1 performers because they had just agreed to list or report their what is it?
Scope 3 emissions.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're going all the way to scope 3. Yeah.
So that is something that very few companies have done yet.
Yeah.
And so in one sense, I think Costco is working hard to improve. And if we're writing nasty letters to Costco, we should really write to them as allies, in my opinion.
Yeah, thank them for what they're doing right and recommend better. Yeah.
Cory's making an excellent point there, and the Third Act campaign is very much structured to enlist and recruit Costco as an ally, as someone who will work with us to pressure Citibank to make the changes in behavior that they want to make.
Excellent. One last question in the corner here, and we'll have to cut it off there. You have your hand up a moment ago? No. Oh, you did. Oh, okay. In that case, I think we're good. Dan, Cory, thank you very much. And we'll be putting the recording up and the resources as we have time to get those things together. And for right now, everybody needs to go hustle to lunch and get back in 45 minutes. Sorry, you got to be quick. We'll have the worships and Bible study coming up.
If anybody online isn't going to lunch, I can stick around.
I have a question for him.
Okay.
Which is, you talked about Third Act faith. Can you hear me or should I get closer?
I can hear you, yes.
Okay, you talked about Third Act faith. I'm a member of Third Act Arizona. Is Third Act the sort of thing where you can join state and interest group and?
Yeah. In fact, Third Act Faith is national, and much of what we do is reinforced by the regional groups. I'm a founding member of Third Act Faith, and I'm in the process of starting a Third Act Tennessee. So there's nothing mutually exclusive about within one group.
All right, I'm going to need to stop the recording here and